Hello, we are back. Welcome everyone to episode 1 of series 2 of Are You Experienced, the podcast all about the business of experiences. I am a little bit older, a little bit wiser, and dare I say a little bit more experienced than I was the first time around, but I'm continuing my quest to learn from the best in the business as I navigate this incredibly rich and interesting industry that we call the experience economy. I could not be starting series 2 with a more exciting guest. I'm joined this week by the brilliant Christian Lachel, Chief Creative Officer at BRC Imagination Arts. Christian has been a driving force behind the success of BRC over the last almost 30 years and is a global authority on what I consider to be the ultimate expression of the experience economy in terms of the balance between magic and money, which is brand homes, and we're going to dig into those in great detail. So, without further ado, on with the show. Christian, hello. Welcome to Are You Experienced?
Hey, it's great to be here. Really excited. Thanks for having me, Joe.
Really excited to dive in. It's your background and particularly the work that you do on brand experience and brand homes is absolutely fascinating to me. So I'm looking forward to diving into that. Now, I mean, you've had an incredible run with BRC Imagination Arts, which we'll come to in a minute. But let's go all the way back to the beginning. I'm fascinated by origin stories, and kind of ask everyone to do this. So, you actually started out in the U.S. Navy. So, talk us through your journey from there to what you're doing now, and how that kind of grounding has shaped your approach to work and to life, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and yeah, everyone's got a different origin story getting into this industry. I think it's never a straight line. Yeah, in my career, I had a lot of jobs when I was a kid. I grew up in a household that I was always working. I love to have lots of whether it was caddying or doing, working at a pizza place in Chicago. I grew up in Chicago, outside of Chicago, in the suburbs of, which was a great place. I love the city. I was really close to the city. It was a lot of influence in my life. And one of the things about growing up in Chicago is that we have one of the largest recruit training commands for the U.S. Navy, just north of Chicago. It's called Great Lakes. And when I was in high school, I was in an NROTC program, and I spent my summers with the Navy. And while I was doing that, I got really hooked on, I liked the discipline. I liked the structure. I was a very creative and wild kid, and I played a lot of sports, hockey, wrestled. But I needed something, like no one had ever gone to college in my family. So I didn't know college was even an option. And actually, my family was a multi-generational U.S. Navy. Going back to my great-great-grandfather, who immigrated from Iceland to the United States and was in World War I with the U.S. Navy. And so I'm actually fourth generation U.S. Navy. I trained with NROTC, like this cadet program, and then when I went into the service, I actually graduated high school early. Went into the U.S. Navy and spent just about 3 years active duty. But my role there was really one was learning how to basically lead teams. I was 18 years old and led an 80-person company in boot camp. And then after that, I went into special warfare training in Coronado with the SEALs. So I was down at BUDS, and I was in that program and spent time in that training program. And then I had an accident that pivoted my entire career. So after spending time in the Naval Special Warfare Command Center in the community there, and learning from a lot of incredible officers, when I had my injury, I'm a disabled vet, and I had to I got out of the service sooner than I wanted to. But what happened as a result of that is that I think being around those teams, especially small units and that kind of special warfare training, and being inspired by the officers and a lot of people who took me under their wing, being kind of a younger person and seeing something in me, I really got the sense that anything is possible. That you can do things if you have some grit and some passion and that determination and the freedom to kind of go after things. And so when I got out of the Navy, I was really kind of broken. Not physically, I was still recovering, but I was also in a place where I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And the reason I went into the Navy was that as a kid, I art and design art was always easy for me. I don't know, it just came natural. Like it was my aunt worked for Dungeons and Dragons, TSR, in Lake Geneva when it first started. I grew up in, the late 70s and in the 80s, and there's just this period of time of toys and storytelling and movies like Star Wars and Incredible Worlds that were being built, and I loved all of that. I was a huge Star Wars fan, huge D&D player. I grew up on the advent of video games. I remember the first video game systems, and when I got out of the Navy, I got a job in marketing in Chicago and working for an agency, and that opened my eyes to like there's a career in art and there's a career in design. And I ended up going back and using that my GI Bill to go to school in design after I spent some time at the agency. And then I met a great teacher who was there, who who was an auto designer and also worked for Young and Rubicon in advertising. And he said, "You got to go to Art Center." And I wanted to get back to California after a couple of winters in Chicago. I was like, I would love to get back to Southern California. So I ended up at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. And while I was there was a program kind of beginning called entertainment design. And I was fortunate enough to be part of the group that was kind of inventing it on the fly, as part of this group of people who were just like, we're going to work in entertainment and we're going to tell stories and we're going to be inspired by the world of video games and the world of theme parks and the world of stories and where we can build spaces. And I got I got into the sponsored studio for Universal Creative,
Right.
and they were working on at the time Islands of Adventure, and I designed for my sponsored project. I worked on a ride for Apollo 13. And as doing that, I was hooked because all of a sudden, everything that I loved had kind of come into full focus. And I basically ran into a teacher that had worked at Imagineering literally on the fly because I got so inspired by this world. I was down at Disneyland sketching every weekend and looking at audiences and how they responded to spaces and what they would do. And I was doing this on my own. It wasn't even a class. And I literally ran into a teacher from first term who worked at Imagineering. She said, "I'm at this new company called BRC. I'm working on this project in Germany. Do you have any time?" And I said, "Well, I have the summer off. Can I come and work?" And I'd love to have a job because I wanted to start working in the industry. And that's how I got in at BRC. And 29 years later, here we are. And I'm one of the owners of the company and the agency. And I've had an incredible career. And I really thought I was going to see the world with the Navy. And I saw the world working in this industry and working with people in cultures around in every corner, every sort of spot, every little nook and cranny, and been able to be fortunate to tell incredible stories to people around the world as part of incredible teams. So a lot of the stuff that I was hoping to get in the Navy, seeing the world, working with great teams, working with elite groups of individuals who are highly specialized and great at their jobs, and the ability to transform the world in some way instead of maybe through a different mechanism, we get to create joy and we get to create memories and transformation. And there's nothing greater than that. So, that's my journey. That's my origin story.
What a fantastic story. I love that. And it got me thinking. I didn't think about this coming in, but one of my all-time favorite, if not my all-time favorite business books, is a book called Turn the Ship Around by L. David Marquet. I don't know if you've come across it, but he was a submarine captain in the US Navy, and it's his kind of story of creating this leadership style of pushing decision making to the edge, and all of the incredible things that happen when you do that. And so just listening to you talk there is interesting that the when you're dealing with groups of very talented sort of elite specialist people, then that I've always found that's been a bit of a Bible for me. So it's just funny that taking it from the US Navy to company building.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where people sometimes go, really, that line to that line, how did that work? But when you really get down to the principles, the values, there's a lot of similarities, a lot of overlap, and it's been beneficial. I would say the one The one difference is that, obviously in the service, you've got there's very much, you could be, a lot of orders and there's a lot of structure, which is great. But at the same time, creativity needs this flexibility, needs this
Mm.
openness. And so I think the thing that I learned at Art Center was to find the best parts of this. And I worked with some really great leaders, creative leaders, to kind of think about and I still work on this every day because I default back to this training often in my life. Even though because it's so foundational when you're growing up at that age, that you also have to remember you are in an incredibly creative space. And so the ability to switch between these almost personas as needed is really important, but also not to be too disciplined and too structured, to not let the creativity happen in the right way, and for the teams to feel supported and safe to really push and try things, and then eventually everyone needs to make decisions together to get something decided. But it's about trying to find that balance, and that's something I've had to work on my entire career, and I
Mm.
think it's something I work on every day. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, amazing. And yeah, it's fascinating that you're the first kind of military vet I think that we've had on the show, but the people's origins always end up shaping, the entry into people end up in the same place, but with very, very different perspectives based on those kind of groundings. So it's fascinating to hear. Um, so, so BRC, Imagination Arts, it's about as iconic, I think, an organization as they come in this industry, within the business of experience design. Um, I had the great pleasure recently, actually, of hearing from the man himself, Bob Rogers, at London Experience Week, which was properly inspiring stuff. But for those who don't know, what is it that you do as a business, and you've kind of gone into a little bit of what your role is, but kind of help us understand exactly what you're responsible for.
Yeah, well, BRC Imagination Arts, we're heading into our 45th year, and we're a strategy design and production company. And I think the origins of that really, I think it starts with the origins. We talk to a lot of creative leaders and different owners of agencies and companies and stuff, and I think the origin story is always interesting because it gives you kind of the grounding of who you are. Just a little bit on BRC. So we were born out of this era. Yeah, we are one of the older, I would say, older agencies. I know that there's some that are older and so forth in the industry, but not very many. And we were born out of that Epcot era. And I think with Bob, I mean, the BRC stands for Bob Rogers and Company, but Bob realized early in his career that if he made it about himself, it would never grow, and there was an opportunity for more people to be part of the ship and the crew. So by design, he got rid of the Bob Rogers and Company and made it BRC Imagination Arts. And really, at the end of the day, I always like to say, if you want to know who we are, the DNA is all in Epcot, because that's actually where Bob was working. When his famous story of like being fired from Disney 3 times, one from the Magic Shop, and then another one when he was writing television, and then the third time with the Epcot team and working on Impressions of France. So I think when Disney senior leadership met with Bob in France and said, "Hey, we're really struggling to get." Well, they were busy building Tokyo Disneyland, which was the first international park that they had done outside of the U.S. They also were still trying to finish Epcot, and they had this client, General Motors, and the World of Motion, and I think that they needed help on that. So really, we're one of the. I always like to say we're probably one of the original roll or spin outs, almost like a rollout of Disney in Imagineering, because now today you have incubators and you do that, but back then it wasn't a thing.
Mm.
And so we were spun out of Disney, and Epcot is a perfect example, because if you think about Epcot, it's a World's Fair, it's a permanent World Expo. And our first work started at World Expos in '86, and of course the work that we were doing at General Motors for World of Motion and Epcot. But it really was this, and what World's Fairs do really well is they have different components, right? There's corporate pavilions if you go to a World's Fair or World Expo. And then there's these kind of cultural pavilions that talk about nations and stories and people. So we had worked on Impressions of France. So we were working with culture. We were telling stories about this incredible place. At the same time, we were working with World of Motion, with General Motors and with Disney, who at the time, they were the Googles and of the world at that point, right? They were the Apples. They were the two largest companies in the world at that moment. So our launch starts with that. So we started working with brands immediately, telling stories, creating transformation, bringing these stories to life to millions of visitors who are visiting Epcot. And we were busy, and we started to work in culture, telling stories with indigenous people in at some of the First Nation tribes and so forth in Vancouver and Expo 86, and working with corporations like Canadian Pacific and GM. And out of that came these incredible opportunities where we had our first Academy Award nominations. We started to build a reputation around that work, but it's still, to me, still comes back to that, right? We're still doing World Expo pavilions. We've had the best presentation at three of the last 5 World Expos. We're still doing work with brands and corporations and brand homes, flagships, factory tours, all kinds of stuff, innovation spaces. We're doing work in culture. That's probably the biggest piece that's grown, because we do a lot of work with museums, whether it's the Lincoln Presidential Museum, the Hoover Presidential Library, Museum of Liverpool in England, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And we work now where these other places emerge, like sport with the Raiders, or in music, or whatever it happens to be. We spend a lot of time in culture. So that's kind of, and we still have a toehold in entertainment. We do still work with some of the studios and in some of the parks, but it's still got a part of our origin story. It's authentic to who we are, but all of it that holds it together, the one thing I would say is it all comes back to this idea of magic with heart. We have always been known as a company that creates a little bit of magic, whether you call that awe, wonderment, enchantment, whatever it is, with the heart of the audience and the story that we're telling. That's deep story, right? It's right in our heart. And it's about this transformation that we seek to create. And I think that, regardless of category, regardless of location, it's still about people and giving people this sort of relief from, or this moment to step out of their day to day and into, whether it's an amazing place or an amazing story, or something that we're creating that takes them into a world of enchantment and wonder. And that's always been true, and that will always be true of BRC.
Yeah, I'm new to the world of experiences, and that's kind of, what the purpose of this podcast is me learning from the best in the business as I go. But what fascinates me is, and I want to talk about brand homes specifically, but we will go back to some of those other pieces as well. But just from a kind of a commercial and a sort of business perspective, that's an incredible feat to pull off, right? So that being able to create something that is, at least as far as I can see so far, is the ultimate expression of what we're talking about when we talk about the experience economy, right? We're talking about ticketed experiences that people pay to go to, but they're spending a few hours immersed in a commercial brand ultimately, and leaving, transformed into a loyal customer, or certainly a different level of customer than before they went. So it's like infinite, unlimited ROI, right? Right, if we're in that context. So let's talk a bit about brand homes specifically, and how you think about them at BRC. I know you're kind of a particular expert in them. So yeah, help me understand them specifically, and whether I'm kind of right in my assessment.
No, it's actually, it's a great, again, it goes back to this kind of deeper question about, like, why would people spend time with brands and pay for it, and all this kind of stuff. And it goes back to, I gave a talk at the Brand Experience Center conference when it first launched a couple years back. And and even people in the industry, I kind of had to go back in time to talk about the long history of this, and this isn't a new phenomenon. It's something that's been going for a long time. If you look at the history just for a second on brands engaging with audiences, it goes as far back to the traders in these great kind of trade ports and cities in ancient times of people with goods, handcrafting them, marking them, and going to the public market, whatever that is, the forum, the public market, and having to differentiate themselves from other people, right? And the best ones always told the best story, right? And then it became the packaging around that told the story, and then eventually became the experiences. And the rise of kind of brand experiences that, and I think of them as destinations, and they come in all kinds of forms. There are brand homes, and there's flagships, and there's tours, and there's innovation, and there's brand hotels. The world of brand experiences is really wide. There's probably about 18 different categories that we actually work across in this space. And what's fascinating is that brands early days, actually at World's Fairs, started to realize the power of creating experiences that could stand out in these world. And at that point, people would go to a World's Fair because they couldn't travel on planes. If you look at the Crystal Palace, right, and the original World's Fair as we know it today, industrial fair, Schweppes, which is a great brand, they literally on the can have the symbol of the fountain that was in the middle of the Crystal Palace, and that fountain is the symbol you will find on a Schweppes can today. And so brands, yeah, and most people don't know this. Even if you look at Heineken started doing experiences at the fairs, both in Paris and in London. They started to build their credentials. They won all these awards, but they created experiences. People would come and they would enjoy the Heineken experience. Otis Elevator, their very first place where they ever demonstrated their elevators was the owner of the company got on this giant platform, and it's a really famous story, and cut the rope because people thought that the elevators weren't safe, and it was the first locking system. And the fact that he did it was a bit of theater right in this middle of this industrial fair. It launched Otis. I mean, so the reality is people have always been fascinated with companies and how things work. We've seen this on industrial tours. The Ford Rouge factory had one of the greatest uh, coming out of the 1933 World's Fair. Henry Ford took the Rouge factory, his pavilion he designed for that fair, moved it to the factory in Dearborn. That factory, that space, that pavilion, they're called the Rotunda, hosted people on tours at that factory starting after in like 34 or 35, and went all the way until the place burnt down in the 60s. It would get more visitors per year than the Statue of Liberty in the United States in New York.
Wow.
So people are fascinated with these things. So we love this world, right? It's not something that's new. It has very clear definitions of how it's evolved from trade show, like from little pop-ups and markets and fairs, to then becoming retail shops and stores, to then becoming museums. Museums go back really long time with brands. Brand museums go back over 150, 200 years. There's been brand museums. And you get to today, all we're doing, it's like I always say, like Pablo Picasso talked about this. He went into the caves in Lascaux and he came out after 3 days and said, "We've learned nothing." And what he meant by that is that we're still, give me a black cave, a dark cave, a torch, and some imagery, and let me tell you a story. And so what we're doing is we're inviting people into an immersive place. They opt in, and they get to go on a journey with us to learn about a brand or a place. And what I would say, the one thing that's changed is they become very, over time, especially in the last 15 years, 20 years, um, they become such an important part of the playbook for modern marketers. I think we understand that with the fleeting nature of the attention span, and what we're finding is that people are spending more time in experiences, and they come in lots of different forms, but brands understand the power of this transformation. And it's not only legacy brands, it's new brands, brands that are starting. They understand the in real life experience is massive. The opportunity to directly engage is is so important to the playbook. Is it the only part of the playbook? No. Is it an important strategic part? Yes. And as we grow them, they become things like what we put out a couple of about a month or about 7 weeks ago, the Kaye Chocolate Park in Switzerland, right? This amazing, amazing story of a destination. So what we're seeing now is an incredible move towards really thinking about authenticity of place, the product that's unique, the people that bring those stories to life, and finding a way to bring all that together into something that's really more than just an advert. It has a sense of history, it has a sense of purpose, and it gives you a place in access into things that you normally don't get the chance to see or
Mm.
experience. And that's the power. That really is the power of it.
My I guess induction into the world of the modern world of brand homes was through one of your projects, actually, which was the Heineken experience in Amsterdam. And this is about, I don't know, I guess 15 years ago, something like that. And I still recommend it to every single person that tells me they're going to Amsterdam. But also that idea of transformation, it completely changed my perception of the Heineken brand. And that's not just kind of, I'm not just saying that. The friend I was with would agree. We kind of, in the UK, and this is why it's so interesting, that combination of tourism and destination and brand experience, is that in the UK, I think probably because of local brewing and kind of, the distribution partners and things like that, Heineken was a fairly low rent brand in the UK for beer when I was growing up. And then you went and did the Heineken experience and emerged a kind of a real, advocate for the true Heineken brand and the product itself. It's just fascinating that, I was actually recommended it by someone else at work who said it was the greatest sales pitch they'd ever seen. And how early was that sort of project in shaping how you think about brand homes and the work that you do on that category in particular?
Um, yeah, that is a great project to highlight because it does represent a bit of a pivot on things. So we've designed a lot of brand experiences well before that. And what's interesting, and I like to talk about this a little bit. In the last 15 years, we've opened as many projects as we did in our first 30.
Oh,
We've
wow.
been really, really busy. And we've had almost like a hockey stick curve to this, in an upward trajectory of the brands that we work with. And part of this was we had worked on some really great, I would say some really great brand tours and pavilions for corporations and stuff. We had a lot of deep knowledge in that. But Heineken was a bit of an unlock. So a little bit about the Heineken experience. It actually started off as called the Heineken, Heineken Treat and Visitor Center or something like that. It was like this thing they started in the 90s. And it was just like, yeah, it was like called the Treat Center or something like that. And then it became the Heineken experience a little bit after that. They kind of changed the name. The Treat Center didn't make sense. But when they approached us about the project, they had kind of gotten stagnant on their story and their experience because they hadn't updated it in several years, and it felt like a museum. And so we won the project, in a bit of a shootout and pitch with a lot of the really great companies at the time. And what I think they were what they really were looking for was story. And we in the room we pitched a story not for them, actually, just how we tell stories, and they really liked that. And there were a lot of things that were really working at the Heineken experience, but there was kind of something that was kind of a little bit not right. And part of it was, as we looked at the story, the bones were there, but it was the sequence of ideas. So they had a lot of things that were thought disordered, meaning things out of sequence with each other. They they didn't quite understand. They were trying to serve everybody, and by serving everybody, they didn't serve anybody at all. So it was a little less focused than it needed to be. And then the other part of it was a real marketing drain for the company. It was actually a project that was really kind of wasn't really losing. It wasn't like quote unquote losing money, but it was definitely heavily supported and financed by the advertising promotion budget. And so that was kind of a thing. If you're a new CMO coming into Heineken, all of a sudden you're like, wow, I've got this asset that I didn't create, and now I've got to support it because I've got to give part of my marketing budget to support it. So one of our goals was to do a couple of things on that project. One, how could we sort of fix the story? How could we sort of reorganize the story so that it actually had more power and emotion and was sequenced properly in order for people to follow it? Because if things are out of sequence, it's like, stories are like tennis balls. If I can only give you so many messages at a time before you can't juggle them. The other thing too is that when you look at process, if you kind of, if you go this way and then you start talking about this and now you're back on that thing, you lose people. And so there's got to be, you don't have to be prescriptive, but you could still be agentic in terms of how
Mm.
people experience things. But there is some structure to things of the way that we understand and we learn. And
Mm.
that wasn't working. The other part was we also understood that the business case needed to change. So one of the things that I didn't talk about early in my career at BRC, but one of the things that was really important with Bob was our first mentor. In addition to Bob being a key mentor, um, was this gentleman by the name of Harrison Buzz Price, and
Hmm.
Buzz was Walt Disney's economic advisor. He was the one who figured out where to put Disneyland, where to put Disney World, and he understood. He was a Stanford economics guy. He basically created the economics for this industry. He
Mm.
pioneered them, all the different feasibility and marketing and companies that do this now. The DNA goes straight back to Buzz. It does. And I
Mm.
was fortunate enough as a young person working in the industry to go on the road with Buzz and Bob, and to be in the room and watching these masters kind of talk about going back from economics to story and back and forth. So when you have mentors like that who are thinking from an economic perspective and from a story perspective and how the two support each other, that is also critical. So as we looked at that, we looked at how to reframe, how to look at the budget, how to look at the business case, and we also looked at the target audience. And Joe, it's kind of funny that you bring up that's you, because we understood at that time one of the biggest travelers were uh, males in a certain age group coming from the UK to Heineken. And a lot of it was designed specifically for that transformation you just talked about. So,
Yeah.
but it was intentional. We understood who they, now by doing that, we also, it like grew. And so what happened as a result of fixing, so we fixed story, right? We got the story right. We of course amplified and made some personalization. We did the bottle your own, which was the first innovation of its type at that time. Now everybody does it, but it was the first. And we fixed the business, we fixed the audience focus, we fixed the story together with Heineken. Nobody does this alone, with the brand, with the clients, hand in glove. And then the magic started to happen. They started to market it right. They started to grow just by making those pivots. All of a sudden, the project became profitable. It became a profit center for Heineken, not a loss. The attendance grew from 250,000 to 1.2 million, and the overall numbers and transformation and scores all transformed. And the result of that then led to work with Guinness and other things. That was in the world of spirits, beer, beverage, wine. That project was an unlock for us as a company, because we completely changed the way we really changed the way that these things were thought about, not just as marketing, but also as a true destination that could be a profit and basically a very key strategic asset for these brands.
Yeah. And I mean, it definitely worked on me. So it's good to know that that was intentional.
Well,
Yeah. And we touched briefly on category there, right? So do you think these work, these, I'm sure, you know, some version works across categories, but are there categories that lend themselves more to brand homes than others? Or do they work for any category, do you believe?
I do think that for brand homes, it has to be probably a consumer facing product, in terms of, or offer. Only because, and we've worked on, and I'll give an example. we've worked on brand tours and factory tours, let's say for Boeing, um, which is a great company, and they've had some, they've had some challenges over the years, but they had a public facing tour. But it's not something that I think people are fascinated there with a manufacturing story at scale,
Mm.
right? How do you create a plane? But it's not really a product where you can buy it, right? Unless unless you're, and we actually worked on a whole B2B and B to government, business to government, part of that. Where that's where the real sales are happening. But I would say that it tends to lean towards things that I think people inherently are interested in and or use in their lives on a more frequent basis. So spirit and beverage and food are really great. I think a lot of people love food production. They love tastings like that. Automotive is, you can see the amount of time has been spent in automotive and aerospace. So I guess I haven't really found a category that doesn't work. But I do think there's some that are just more naturally prone for it.
Yeah.
But the power of place is so important. I think, the difference between, I'd say, like a brand home or a flagship or a tour, they're different than pop-ups. I mean, I love pop-ups, and I think they have a really great place in the world, or an event, very temporary event experience. Um, they serve a role, especially in emerging markets. But when you have something, let's say, like Destination Guinness or Destination Scotland, if you look at Johnny Walker, there's something about coming to a city like Dublin or to Edinburgh and sort of being in a place and getting these stories that are truly authentic to Scotland or to Ireland. And they're part of, almost like part of national identity,
Yeah.
and especially in a category. So there's something it's different, right? It's different than pop-ups, and I think that power of place and destination is such an important factor in why these things work. So I think the one thing that's true, and
Mm.
we worked on a brand home, a new one in China for the Chuan distillery, a beautiful distillery, one of the first whiskey, kind of Western meets Eastern, whiskey experiences in China, in area called Yimishan in the Sichuan province. And it's a
Mm.
beautiful setting. Destination's gorgeous, the art, but it's a new brand. But the
Mm.
thing is, you're building the power of place and story and identity through the brand home itself. And you're building, so that power of place is so important in these. So I think that's a factor versus the product, the category itself is, do you have like a great destination that's kind of one of one,
Yeah.
something so unique that you
Yeah.
have to go and visit it. Yeah.
Interesting. And so that sort of feeds into where in that process, or I suppose what I'm really asking is, what is your process? Is obviously the benefit of of the company being around for 45 years is that you've finessed and continue to evolve, as you say, the process of creating these things and determining what the right moves are, and even when it comes to the Heineken, like you say, being able to recognise the misalignment and the misordering of different beats of the story. What is your process, to the extent that you can share the secret sauce, if you like? But how would you describe that? And when you're coming at things like place and story and the DNA of a brand, how does that kind of work sequentially?
Yeah. It all starts with our core philosophy, which is deep story. And this is the book that Bob's kind of getting ready to, release in September. But, so we'll be kind of giving a lot away in that book, I think, through his philosophy. But at the end of the day, you've got to go deep to figure out what rises to the top. And we start our process a couple of different ways depending on the project and the type. Oftentimes we're coming in very early to sense check or to create a pre-feasibility or a pre-strategy on something to see if there's something there, right, before there's a larger investment, just to make sure the audience is there and the mechanisms for success are there. So that's one step that we've done that I think is very important. Some projects are already established and they want us to come in and help them, but we always start with the heart of the audience in the heart of a brand. And let's take each of those. So the heart of the brand is getting in deep, doing the listening sessions, spending time with the different groups, spending time with leadership and key stakeholders, spending time with, everybody from the factory to the C-suite. And I think by doing that and immersing ourselves in the stories and the places and getting on the ground, that work of just kind of deep research and deep listening unlocks things that might be just either in plain sight or something that happens. I'll give you an example. One of our Academy Award nominations came from a moment with Bob when he was with General Motors and he was in the factory, and they were shooting um they were shooting in the paint booths. And he said, isn't that really interesting? I programmed them so that they're basically on a beat, so it's like 1, 2, 3, 1, you know what I mean? Whatever it happened to be. And it was actually the guy who was doing it was actually listening to classical music. And by looking at that, Bob was able to go, oh, it actually is timed with the music and in a classical arrangement. And that became Ballet Robotique, which was one of our Academy Award nominations. So it's the little things. You can look at a lot of brand decks, you can get a lot of briefs. The heart of it is getting in underneath and really digging and spending time with the archives, and equally with the archives as you do with the marketing team,
Mm.
and understanding that. The other part of it is deep audience insights, right?
Yeah.
Understanding who they are and what's motivating them, what's happening in culture unique to the place, what are people looking for when they're coming to a place if they're tourists. By defining the audience and really getting a sense of what their hopes and desires are, and getting beyond just the sort of veneer work that sometimes happens, with personas and algorithms. Like, I don't why I like those things. I don't think they always reveal the most in-depth stories. I'll give you an
Mm.
example of that. Working with China Mobile, China Telecom on the expo in Shanghai in 2010. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out how people used information communication technology. And at the
Mhm.
time in 2008, the iPhone had just been released. So we didn't live in a world where all of this stuff that we have now existed. It was all brand new. And we were starting to see, like, how were people using their phones before an iPhone, right? And how would we predict what was going to happen? And we went into different people's spaces, and you'd learn that people would tell you one thing on an audience survey and they do completely different. Like, one of the grandfathers that we met had 3 different phones in his pocket, one for his friends, one for his wife, and one for his girlfriend.
Mm.
He's not going to tell you that on an insights thing, right? Like, he's not going to say that, right? But we knew what we figured it out. Another guy was this cool influencer, right? This guy who was like sneakers and cool Chinese like influencer, and we sat down with him and we got him his house, and um, set up the cameras, and we were chatting and looking at his sneaker collection and all this kind of stuff. And I asked him a very simple question. I said, what's your, just out of curiosity, what's your favorite movie? And he said, can you shut the camera off? And I said, yeah, sure. But why? He said, just shut it off. And I said, well, what's your favorite movie? And he said, well, I got to tell you, he said, I got all this stuff and I'm an influencer. But he goes, honestly, I'm actually quite lonely. I mean, I live isolated and I don't really have a girlfriend, and I'm spending all my time doing the social, and I've got money, but I don't have anybody to love in my life. And he said, my favorite movie is Titanic. I just want to be Jack. I want to find the love of my life. And you're like, what the hell? Like, this super
Yeah.
cool guy with like a mohawk and like all this kind of, like really cool hair. And
Yeah.
and at the end of the day, what you find is that we're more alike than we are different, and there's certain things that we all hope for in our lives, and that allowed us to think about dreams. Like, the theme of the pavilion became dreaming big, because what we found was that technology would allow us to dream the biggest dreams of possible. So it unlocked the story. And then from there, we get everybody together in a charrette process. We learned from Walt Disney. So this is the last piece of it. Walt was so frustrated when he was trying to build Disneyland. And we know this directly from the people, because Buzz was part of the team doing that, that he would go to his architects, they tell him one thing. He'd go to his investors, they tell him another thing. He'd go to his art and design team, they tell him something else. He finally got so frustrated with it, he said, the hell with it. I'm going to have everybody in the same room at the same time. We're going to make decisions. And a good idea can come from anybody. And that started this process of charrette. And we learned it directly from Buzz, who learned it from Walt, who was in the room. And so it's really just this third-hand process that we've learned directly from Walt. And I think that synthesizing the charrette and something that we find honed over the years is really a key to getting the foundation right. And if you set the right North Star and constellation of experiences around that, and knowing who your audience is, then it gives you the roadmap of where you're going, and it keeps you on track. And then the other trick of it, Joe, is that it doesn't end in that moment. It doesn't end in concept. It doesn't end in design. You just don't hand the script. You don't let Steven Spielberg create the script and then hand it to an amateur filmmaker and hope that you're going to get a Steven Spielberg film, right? The reality is follow through is so important. So we are stewards of story. We are producers who understand, and that continuous improvement happens. And you know this, I mean, I'm a director, and we've done some films, and I've directed films, and our team does a lot of us come out of theater. They come out of filmmaking. They come out of creating stories and producing and bringing it all together. But the role of the executive producer on a project, the role of the producer, is to make sure that everybody is telling the same story and protecting the story and being there with the promises that you made to senior leadership and to the archive team, and following through so that the thing that you talked about at the beginning and that transformation that you're working for doesn't get lost. Because if it transfers from person to person and then different teams are delivering it, they don't understand what the intention was and why. So that's part of the thing of making sure the follow through is there. And that's why we've always been, not just a strategy company. We've always been a strategy through production and actual operations, because it's so important to get it anywhere along that line. It's really easy to lose it. It's really, story is hard. Keeping it together is hard. Creating a successful business is hard. So you've got to, that sort of attention and producing mentality, creative producing mentality, is so critical to getting to the right delivery. And I see so many, I love a lot of the groups that are out there and stuff, but the handing over the work, it means that you have to design it so that other people can deliver it. And it doesn't mean that you do it the same way, because you're not going to be there. So it's just different. we're just built differently, I guess, maybe, than some.
Yeah.
And I know others do that too, but that's core to us.
Well, yes, the others do that. I think my experience is that level of sort of strategic rigor, if you like. A lot of issues. We did a lot of work in like immersive entertainment, for example, IP led immersive entertainment, that kind of thing. And it strikes me that a lot of what goes wrong in those kinds of projects is downstream of the failure to do the first bit that you mentioned, that kind of deep audience understanding. Fandoms in particular, if you take something like Star Wars, you've got incredibly visceral, canon versus not canon, and all of these kinds of nuances within that fandom that, unless you're really careful and you really kind of go deep on that, you can fail totally with what is seemingly a kind of an open goal in terms of an IP that is just so universally loved and massive. So yeah, that's key. And also just that whole thing that you say about nuance and texture, and that is, well, as you know, that's really the whole ethos behind my company. But from a measurement standpoint is, trying to measure something as rich and complicated and as nuanced as human experience, with one-dimensional kind of flat metrics like NPS and all this kind of stuff is that we sort of say the same thing about that it's kind of folly when, you know, what you need is measurement that preserves that texture, because otherwise you just end up chasing the NPS score rather than actually a better experience.
That's right.
Yeah, good to hear you talk about that sort of nuance and texture piece. Well, look, we're nearly the end of our time. I normally ask a couple of sort of quick fire questions here, but I think we've probably only got time for one. Well, actually, I'll ask two. So the first is, I'm sure you do this already, but if you had to give some advice to the younger generation starting out in the industry, and particularly wanting to get into the kind of work that the BRC Imagination Arts do, what would that advice be?
You know, you gotta read. You have to, like, I would say the success is endless curiosity. You have to be a lifelong learner, and I think if you can spend the time, whether it's reading or watching, but I think, you know, you've got to spend some time really understanding the why of what we're doing. And the strength, I think, is we like to think of the team as people who are T people or Swiss Army knives that have lots of different things in their life that they've done. Just because I think it gives you a really rich kind of perspective to come to a team with. And I would say experience as much as you can, read and really get deep into this industry. If you really want to be in it and do this, I think it's a lifelong study and it never ends, and it's incredibly rewarding. But one book isn't going to do it. You know, read Bettelheim on fairy tales and understand the power of why fairy tales work. Like, if you really want to get into story, you know, then read Chip Heath on what makes a story stick, and get as many of those perspectives as you can, because it helps you become a stronger storyteller, designer, producer, and experience maker, you know, a world builder.
I think that's good advice for any industry, right? Be curious. And then ultimately, the advice I give to any young people is have a point of view, but it can't just be, like you say, it can't just be lifted. It has to be your point of view that's kind of synthesized from actually doing the work and being curious. Yeah, no, that's great advice. The final question I always ask everyone, which sort of puts you on the spot a little bit, is this is supposed to be an ongoing conversation. So who do you recommend I speak to next, and what should I talk to them about?
That's always a good question. Well, I love my friend Laura Cilio-Pavad from Pernod Ricard. She's the head of all the brand homes, and if you want to stay on this track, I think she's a wonderful person to speak with. She's a good friend, and she knows so much about this industry and the destinations that are being built. I'd recommend her. She's lovely, and I think you'd have a great time.
Fantastic. All right. Excellent recommendation. Well, listen, Christian, it's been an absolute pleasure. I could talk about these topics for forever. So I'll let you get on with your day. But yeah, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. Thanks.